Do you believe that if it wasn't Spain or Portugal, but rather Tartaria, an empire nearly erased from human memory, that was actually the first to set foot and establish colonies in the Americas? And if this were true, could the entire story of the discovery of the New World, we were taught, simply be an elaborately staged play meant to conceal a shocking truth? If we look back at ancient maps from the 16th to the 18th centuries, we see strange names, coastlines, drawn with unbelievable accuracy for the time, and even the name Tartaria sprawling across Eurasia. Unofficial researchers have raised the question, was Tartaria not limited to the Eurasian continent, but also extended its influence all the way to the Americas? Why do many structures in Mexico, Peru, and even North America share strange similarities with the planetary architecture we often see in mysterious buildings in Siberia or Central Asia? Could it be that the Tartarians crossed the Atlantic very early, established colonies, and were then erased from history by an invisible hand? What is astonishing is that many records from European explorers who reached Latin America described massive stone cities, plazas, and temples that they believed natives could not have built on their own. But if not the indigenous people, then who? Was it Tartaria, with its lost technology, that left these marks, later attributed to local civilizations? And why have these questions never been addressed openly in textbooks? The influence of Tartaria, if they indeed reached the Americas, would undoubtedly extend far beyond leaving a few architectural relics. Let's look at the pyramids in Mexico, the stone walls in Peru, or the ancient Maya cities with their grid-like streets, plazas, and temples. Why do they bear such an uncanny resemblance to the global classical architecture that many alternative researchers believe to be the hallmark of Tartaria? Could this really be just a coincidence? A more unsettling question is, if Tartaria truly possessed technology far surpassing that of Europe at the time, then were the Spanish and Portuguese invasions merely a cleanup operation, a replacement of power structures? Indigenous populations were wiped out, structures were relabeled, and Tartarian technology was hidden under the guise of being unexplainable. We can see massive arched gateways, monolithic granite pillars, and star-shaped fortresses scattered across North and South America, all resembling a unified planning system rather than isolated constructions by individual tribes. So, if Tartaria truly introduced architecture, construction techniques, and even astronomical knowledge to the Americas, the biggest question is, why does mainstream history ignore this? Could there have been a campaign of erasure, a mud flood, not just of land and stone, but of memory itself? And if so, is everything we believe about the Age of Discovery merely a veneer hiding a far different truth? But let's imagine an alternative scenario. If Tartaria had indeed dominated the Americas, the entire global balance of power might have shifted in a completely different direction. Picture a New York not shaped by Dutch or British influence, but built according to Tartaria's star-shaped urban planning, with symmetrical plazas, vast canals, and energy technology we still can't explain today. Perhaps instead of Spanish galleons hauling gold back to Europe, it would have been Tartaria's transatlantic trade routes that served as the global economic lifeline. If Tartaria controlled the Americas, would the Industrial Revolution have even started in Britain? Or would Tartaria, with the immense resources of the New World, have become the technological center of the globe? The nations we now call superpowers, Britain, France, Spain, might have been mere dependent forces, civilized vassals, living under Tartaria's patronage. And in that case, all of modern history, from world wars to the formation of the United Nations, might have followed a completely different trajectory. Yet, this scenario did not happen. Or perhaps it did, but was concealed, distorted, rewritten. Who rewrote history? Who decided that only Columbus would be honored as the discoverer of America? And more importantly, who benefits from erasing Tartaria from human memory? These questions linger like ghosts on a censored page of history. When we piece all these fragments together, we see a picture that is both fascinating and full of contradictions. Tartaria, the empire that never existed in textbooks, has left countless traces scattered across the world, from Eurasia to the Americas. massive architectural wonders, star-shaped fortresses, ancient maps bearing the name Tartaria, spanning continents. All of it seems to whisper to us, there is another truth being concealed. If Tartaria truly was the first to set foot in America, then the mainstream history we've been taught is nothing more than a heavily edited novel with its most crucial chapters removed. Could it be that every subsequent discovery was merely a reconquest, a staged play meant to legitimize the erasure of a once global empire? And because of this, the question is no longer, did Tartaria exist, but rather, why are we not allowed to know about its existence? This is no longer just a matter of archaeology or cartography. It is a question of power, of who holds the pen that writes history. As we conclude this exploration, you don't have to immediately believe every theory, but keep your sense of skepticism. Only by daring to ask questions can we break free from the pre-written pages of history. The truth about Tartaria may have been buried, but you, the one reading these words, are the one who can excavate it anew. And when you ask, if Tartaria was the first to colonize the Americas, would human history still be the same as it is today? You have already stepped into the realm of forgotten truths. The official chronicles of Eurasia describe the rise and fall of the Mongol Khanates, the Timurid Renaissance, and the gradual expansion of Muscovy. Yet scattered across early modern maps appears another entity, Tartaria, often stretching across the roof of the world like a phantom empire. European cartographers labeled Siberia, Central Asia, and even parts of China under its name, as though they sensed a dominion too vast to categorize neatly. For mainstream historians, Tartaria was no more than a vague geographical term, a placeholder for lands unknown. But for those who look closer, the consistency with which Tartaria is drawn raises a haunting question. How can an empire that supposedly never existed leave such a wide cartographic footprint? There are accounts, dismissed as apocrypha, hinting at Tartarian technological prowess. Some legends describe cities with advanced aqueducts in the Siberian wilderness, or towers with lightning rods centuries before Franklin's kite experiment. Travelers' tales even claim Tartarian horsemen used magnetic compasses, enabling them to navigate the northern steppes in perpetual winter. Was this embellishment or a memory of lost knowledge deliberately concealed when Europe rose to global power? One quirky detail lies in the reports of enormous cannon-like devices supposedly stationed in Central Asian fortresses, machines said to launch not stone but fire itself. Whether these were mistranslations of Chinese fire lances or fabrications of nervous Europeans, the image lingers. A steppe empire with access to technology that seemed almost out of time. If such power existed, why would it not extend beyond the steppes? Why would it not dream of reaching the Pacific and beyond? Historians still argue whether Tartaria was ever a unified state or simply a European projection, an umbrella term for tribes and khanates. Some suggest it was a convenient erasure. By calling it Tartaria, Europeans dismissed the individuality of dozens of peoples, preparing the ground for later conquest. Others whisper that the erasure was more deliberate, that a true empire, expansive and innovative, was overwritten so that Spain, Portugal, and later Britain could claim sole ownership of the age of discovery. If Tartaria truly held such power, the question intensifies. Did its ambitions stretch across oceans? And was there ever an attempt to reach the New World before the sails of Columbus? If Tartaria was more than a cartographic illusion, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Could such an empire have reached the Americas at all? The stereotype of nomadic horsemen galloping endlessly across the steppes blinds us to another reality, that Eurasia was crisscrossed by waterways, rivers, and seacoasts that linked land empires to the sea. From the Volga and the Caspian to the frozen coasts of Siberia and the Pacific, Tartaria was positioned astride some of the greatest arteries of water on Earth. Mainstream history admits that the Silk Road was not just one road, but a network, feeding into maritime extensions across the Indian Ocean and even into the Pacific. Chinese junks in the 15th century, under Admiral Zheng He, are documented to have dwarfed the caravels of Columbus. If Ming China possessed such ships, could Tartaria, rival, ally, or inheritor of certain technologies, have experimented with similar vessels? There are obscure reports in Jesuit letters from Siberia of floating fortresses built with planks thicker than a man's arm, though official archives dismiss them as exaggerations. A quirky piece of lore claims that in the far north, Tartarian traders lashed together ice-hardened rafts capable of crossing the Bering Strait. Though implausible as a means of empire, the idea is a reminder that ancient peoples often used the environment itself as a vessel. Archaeologists in Alaska have found bone harpoons with designs nearly identical to those of Siberian tribes. Was this coincidence, or proof of contact across the narrow sea long before Columbus? Historians still argue whether the Tartars, or their neighbors, possessed the maritime willpower to sail into the deep Pacific. Some argue their strength lay entirely in cavalry, not ships. Others counter that empires are rarely static. Just as Vikings transitioned from farmers to raiders, why could Tartaria not have turned from horse to hull? If the routes existed, across Beringia, island hopping through the Kuriles, or even via trans-Pacific currents, then the path was open. The question is not just if they could sail, but if they already did, only to have their voyages erased. The Americas were far from the untouched wilderness, so often painted in European narratives. On the eve of 1492, vast civilizations flourished. The Aztecs built temples that pierced the skies above Tenochtitlan. The Maya calculated celestial cycles with uncanny precision, and the Inca engineered roads and terraced farms that still defy erosion. These were empires of stone, astronomy, and ritual, every bit as sophisticated as the kingdoms across the Atlantic. If Tartaria had crossed the ocean, they would not have found scattered tribes, but formidable states capable of negotiation, resistance, or alliance. Curiously, hints of earlier contact creep into the margins of history. Inscriptions on Olmec heads bear what some fringe theorists claim are Asian features. Polynesian chickens appear in South America centuries before Columbus, their DNA whispering of cross-Pacific voyages. Norse sagas speak of Vinland in the north, and a Chinese monk in the 5th century recorded tales of a land across the Eastern Sea. These may be coincidences, misinterpretations, or exaggerations, but if such threads exist, is it impossible that Tartaria too may have woven its way into that fabric of contact? One quirky legend tells of stone fortresses on the American West Coast that were said to resemble Siberian designs, their origins never satisfactorily explained. Mainstream archaeologists attribute them to indigenous innovation, yet the parallels raise an eyebrow. Could Tartarian scouts or settlers have left faint fingerprints only to be overwritten by the more documented arrival of Europeans? Historians still argue whether the pre-Columbian world was as isolated as the traditional model claims. Some contend that oceans were nearly impassable barriers until 1492. Others, pointing to stray artifacts, linguistic echoes, and genetic anomalies, suggest that small but significant contacts occurred long before Columbus. If that is true, the New World was not a sealed box waiting to be opened. It was a stage upon which forgotten actors, perhaps Tartarian, might have briefly stood. Picture the moment. A fleet of rugged vessels crests the Pacific swells, their sails stitched from felt and horsehair, their hulls reinforced with timber from Siberian forests. On board are Tartarian envoys, archers with composite bows, priests versed in Tengriest sky rituals, and merchants eager for maize and obsidian. As they set foot on American soil, they do not encounter empty beaches but the vibrant pulse of civilizations, bustling markets of the Maya lowlands, Inca messengers, racing along mountain roads, Aztec warriors adorned in jaguar skins. The collision of worlds begins not with cannon fire, but with a wary gaze across the plaza. Mainstream historical comparisons remind us that when Spain met the Aztecs, the result was rapid conquest. But Tartaria carried no deep-sea tradition of crusade. Instead, its culture thrived on absorbing conquered peoples into its vast steppe dominion. Tribute, alliances, and negotiated coexistence were as natural as bloodshed. Would Tartarian emissaries have sought gold with the same insatiable hunger as Castile, or grain, textiles, and sacred objects to enrich their Eurasian networks? This single difference could have rewritten centuries of colonial violence. Quirky tidbits of speculation imagine trade tables heavy with strange exchanges. Siberian furs for cacao beans, felt carpets for turquoise, Mongolian horse breeds for Andean llamas. Perhaps even a cross-pollination of ideas. Steppe astrologers comparing their star charts with Maya astronomers, or Inca engineers marveling at Tartarian knowledge of metallurgy. The cultural synthesis could have been breathtaking, a blending of cosmologies and sciences lost to the erasures of history. Historians still argue whether such an encounter would have been peaceful or catastrophic. Some suggest Tartaria's traditions of tribute might have fostered mutual respect, creating alliances rather than annihilation. Others contend that empires, no matter their origin, seek dominance, and that the fate of American civilizations would have been no kinder under the horsemen of the steppe than under the conquistadors of Spain. Yet the haunting question lingers. Had Tartaria been first, would the Americas have been absorbed, not destroyed? Once first contact was made, the true test would have been in how Tartaria chose to expand its presence in the New World. Unlike the Spaniards who pursued a ruthless model of conquest, dismantling empires stone by stone and converting them under the banner of Christ, Tartaria carried a legacy forged on the steppes: integration through tribute, layered sovereignty, and pragmatic tolerance. From the Mongol Khans to the Timurid courts, the steppe tradition often allowed local rulers to maintain authority so long as they acknowledged a higher overlord. Would that same model have been transplanted across the Pacific? Mainstream history shows us that steppe empires rarely destroyed cultures outright. They taxed them, harnessed their artisans, and demanded loyalty. This pattern raises the tantalizing possibility that the Aztecs, Maya, or Inca might not have been obliterated but drawn into a wider Tartarian confederacy. Instead of Spanish viceroyalties, we might imagine khanates of Tenochtitlan or Cusco, where indigenous rulers bowed to Tartarian khans, yet preserved their cities, temples, and ceremonies. A quirky twist emerges from a little-known 16th century report by European travelers in Siberia, who spoke of vast yurts embroidered with symbols suspiciously similar to Mesoamerican glyphs. The record was dismissed as fanciful, but it prompts a speculative vision. Might cultural fusion have already been underway, only to vanish when European hegemony tightened its grip on the record of history? Imagine codices written half in Quipunats, half in Cyrillic script. Historians still argue whether steppe federations were truly tolerant or simply pragmatic conquerors. Was the famed Pax Mongolica a genuine era of multicultural coexistence, or merely a pause enforced by overwhelming force? If Tartaria had applied the same methods in the New World, would it have created a vast, multi-ethnic empire spanning 2 oceans, or would its subjects have endured exploitation under a different flag? The line between colonization and integration is razor thin, and Tartaria's shadow leaves us wondering which path might have prevailed. Colonization is never only about armies and trade, it is also a battle for the soul. If Tartaria had stepped ashore in the New World, the clash of belief systems would have been profound. Unlike Spain, which carried the singular fire of Catholicism and sought to extinguish all other flames, Tartaria's religious landscape was a kaleidoscope. Within its domain, one could find echoes of the ancient sky worship of Tengriism, the chants of Buddhist monks, the prayers of Orthodox priests, and the whispers of Islamic scholars. How would such a pluralistic empire have met the sun gods of the Aztec, the maize spirits of the Maya, or the mountain deities of the Inca? Mainstream history tells us that the Mongol Khans often tolerated multiple religions at their courts, allowing Christians, Muslims, and shamans to debate side by side. Imagine such an approach in the plazas of Tenochtitlan. Instead of burning temples, Tartarian envoys might have sought syncretism, drawing parallels between Tengri, the eternal sky, and Huitzilopochtli, the solar force of the Mexica. A steppe shaman could have stood alongside an Inca priest, both lifting their arms to the heavens, marveling at how the divine was mirrored in foreign tongues. One quirky speculation lingers in the accounts of Jesuit missionaries in China, who once noted strange foreign rituals in Manchuria resembling Mesoamerican dances. Could this have been mere coincidence, or the faint echo of a deeper, older contact? Rituals carried across oceans by forgotten Tartarian pilgrims. Such possibilities open a door into a world of blended cosmologies, where feathered serpents might have been carved beside winged sky spirits on temple walls. Historians still argue whether religious pluralism in steppe empires was genuine tolerance, or simply a strategy to extract tribute from diverse peoples. If Tartaria had carried this pragmatism into the Americas, would indigenous faiths have flourished in hybrid form, or would they too have been gradually eroded under foreign rule? The mystery is whether the New World would have preserved its gods within a larger empire, or lost them more slowly, hidden beneath the folds of a steppe tapestry. Every empire is ultimately measured by its ability to harness wealth. If Tartaria had planted its banner in the New World, the economic balance of the world would have shifted like a fault line snapping beneath the ocean. The Spanish thirsted for silver and gold, draining Potosi until the mountain itself became a wound in the earth. Tartaria, however, had grown upon the rhythms of trade across Eurasia: furs, silk, grain, and livestock. Would its gaze upon the Americas have been as fixated on bullion, or would it have sought different riches? Mainstream historians remind us that the flood of silver from the Americas into Spain and then China destabilized global markets, fueling inflation that rippled through Europe and Asia alike. Without that silver, could the European Renaissance have bloomed as it did? If Tartaria had instead seized the flow of precious metals, the axis of prosperity might have pivoted eastward. Imagine Moscow begging Tartaria for access to American silver, or European merchants pleading in Samarkand markets for maize, cacao, and turquoise, controlled by Tartarian hands. Quirky theories abound. Some fringe researchers claim that buried in Siberia are hoards of New World gold, carried back not by Spain, but by forgotten fleets from the Pacific coast. No firm evidence proves such voyages, but the rumor itself reveals an undercurrent of unease. What if wealth that should have filled European treasuries was diverted elsewhere, hidden in empires deliberately written out of the story? Historians still argue whether control of silver alone created Europe's rise, or whether the cultural ferment of the Renaissance was inevitable. Yet the counterfactual is clear. Had Tartaria seized the silver veins of Peru, it might not only have financed colossal armies on the steppe, but also reshaped the Silk Road into a golden artery pulsing with American treasure. And if Europe had been denied its bullion lifeline, the very foundations of its global dominance could have crumbled before they were even laid. The shockwaves of a Tartarian foothold in the Americas would have reverberated across both continents, unsettling the delicate balance of power that defined the 15th and 16th centuries. Spain and Portugal, whose treaties carved the world into hemispheres under papal blessing, would have found their ambitions checked by an empire they scarcely understood. Imagine the horror in Seville or Lisbon upon hearing rumors that the riches of the New World were already flowing into Tartarian markets. The papal bulls of division, the Treaty of Tordesillas, would have seemed meaningless against a power unbound by European Christendom. Mainstream records show how fiercely European kingdoms competed with one another for overseas spoils. Yet they were united in their assumption that non-European peoples could be conquered at will. A Tartarian presence would have confounded this unity. Would France and England have aligned with Tartaria to weaken Iberian rivals? Or would they have joined Spain in a holy war to erase the steppe empire from maps once and for all? The 30 Years' War might have spilled not just across Europe, but into the Atlantic and Pacific alike. On the other side of the world, Asia would not have stood idle. The Ming dynasty, already wary of nomadic powers to the north, might have bristled at Tartaria's sudden wealth. The Ottomans, seated astride their own crossroads of trade, could have seen in Tartaria a rival too dangerous to ignore. Even Muscovy, which in reality rose by swallowing steppe lands, might have been reduced to a vassal state squeezed between Europe's Catholic kings and Tartaria's transoceanic reach. One quirky speculation suggests that had Tartaria funneled New World wealth into its armies, Europe might have faced not the timid raids of steppe horsemen, but full-scale invasions with artillery purchased from American silver. Chronicles of the 16th century could have told of Tartarian troops besieging Vienna, while their allies in Mexico City supplied resources across the ocean. Historians still argue whether Europe's dominance was inevitable or contingent. Some insist that Europe's geographic position, maritime innovation, and competitive states guaranteed supremacy. Others counter that had one variable shifted, the control of American wealth, the entire structure of modern history could have tilted eastward. If Tartaria had stood at the apex of this realignment, the modern world map might today be painted in its colors, not those of Europe's colonial empires.
No matter which empire crossed the ocean first, the fate of the indigenous peoples of the Americas hinged on contact. The tragic truth of history is that disease traveled faster than swords. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated populations often before the first gun was fired. Yet if Tartaria had been the first to arrive, could this catastrophe have unfolded differently? Mainstream accounts remind us that European colonization unleashed pandemics that erased up to 90% of indigenous populations. But what if Tartaria's routes of transmission were different? Positioned farther from the Mediterranean disease pool, perhaps fewer pathogens would have crossed the Pacific. Contact through smaller expeditions, tributary relations, or controlled trade might have delayed epidemics, buying precious decades for American civilizations to adapt, resist, or recover. Quirky threads of folklore hint at alternative outcomes. Among some Andean legends are stories of pale strangers who came from the west long before Pizarro, who shared food, then vanished without conquest. Could these tales be distorted memories of early contacts, peaceful exchanges rather than catastrophic invasions? If Tartarian emissaries had indeed arrived, their smaller numbers might have left gifts, knowledge, and warnings rather than plagues. Historians still argue whether demographic collapse was inevitable due to biology alone, or whether the brutality of conquest magnified its effects. Was it simply a matter of germs, or also of swords and chains? If Tartaria had pursued its traditional model of tribute and federated rule, indigenous peoples might have remained powerful actors integrated into a larger empire rather than reduced to subjects in mission towns. The temples of Tenochtitlan might still have stood in grandeur, humming with rituals, their gods not silenced but adapted into a vast transoceanic cosmology. If Tartaria had secured a foothold in the Americas, the trajectory of world history might have pivoted on its axis. A trans-Pacific empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the temples of the Andes would have rivaled Rome in scope and dwarfed Spain in wealth. The very idea of the Atlantic world, that crucible of modern capitalism, empire, and revolution, might never have formed. Instead, the Pacific could have become the great highway of history. Mainstream history holds that the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment emerged in Europe, fueled by New World wealth and the printing presses of the Renaissance. But what if it had been Tartaria, enriched by American silver and maize, that drove new currents of thought? Could Samarkand or Omsk have become the centers of invention, where astronomers blended Maya calendrics with Islamic geometry, or where engineers forged new machines using Inca metallurgical insights? In such a world, the Industrial Revolution might not have begun in Manchester but in the shadow of Siberian factories, humming on Andean tin. A quirky speculation among alternative historians is that the very concept of the United States would never have been born. Without European colonization of North America, there would be no English colonies to revolt, no Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. Instead, the lands of the future United States might have formed a Tartarian Khanate, its towns echoing with both indigenous languages and the clipped syllables of Siberian traders. Could the modern world have spoken not English or Spanish, but a fusion tongue born of steppe and native dialects? Historians still argue whether Europe's ascendancy was a historical inevitability or merely a fragile accident. If Tartaria had drawn the Americas into its orbit, Europe might have been sidelined, its colonies stunted, its revolutions muted. The global order of nation-states might have looked unrecognizable, with Tartaria at its center, a power linking hemispheres across the vast Pacific rather than across the narrower Atlantic. If Tartaria had truly reached the New World, then its erasure from the pages of history becomes even more unsettling. How could an empire vast enough to span Eurasia and bold enough to cross oceans vanish so completely from collective memory? The maps of the 16th through 18th centuries label Tartaria with confidence, sprawling across Siberia and Central Asia. Yet today, schoolchildren know nothing of it. Was this disappearance merely a cartographic convenience, or the deliberate concealment of a rival narrative that threatened Europe's claim to discovery? Mainstream historians argue that Tartaria was a vague label used by Europeans to describe lands they neither understood nor controlled. But such an explanation feels too neat, too dismissive. Empires do not fade into abstraction without reason. One wonders if, in the archives of Lisbon or Rome, documents lie locked away reports of Tartarian expeditions, alliances with American rulers, trade routes that challenged Iberian monopolies. The silence itself feels orchestrated. A quirky anecdote survives from an 18th-century traveler in Russia, who claimed to have seen a map in a monastery showing great Tartarian dominions across the ocean. The map was said to have vanished soon after, never resurfacing. Was this invention, or a glimpse at knowledge deliberately buried? The fact that such stories exist at all speaks to an enduring suspicion that history, as we inherit it, has been edited. Historians still argue whether the absence of Tartaria in modern scholarship is simply the result of evolving terminology or evidence of systematic erasure. If Tartaria had indeed colonized parts of the New World, then its deletion from historical memory would not be accidental, it would be necessary. For Europe to claim sole credit for the Age of Discovery, all rivals had to be forgotten. And so Tartaria, once painted large upon the map, was consigned to whispers, anomalies, and the margins of conspiracy. The question, what if Tartaria had colonized the New World first, is not simply a game of imagination. It is a mirror held up to the silences and contradictions of recorded history. Maps drawn by European hands once displayed Tartaria in bold letters, yet today we are told it never existed. If the empire had crossed the Pacific, its presence could have reshaped every strand of the modern world: religion, economy, politics, and the fate of millions. Perhaps the Aztec pyramids would still stand intact, their gods worshipped in tandem with the eternal sky of Tengri. Perhaps silver would have fueled factories in Siberia instead of Spain. Perhaps the very languages we speak today would be different, blending steppe and native tongues into something unrecognizable. Mainstream historians will dismiss these visions as fantasy, insisting that only Spain and Portugal had the ships, the will, and the backing to transform the Americas. Yet quirky fragments, lost maps, whispered legends, inexplicable parallels remain like bones protruding from the soil, daring us to ask whether the official story has been too carefully curated. Historians still argue over whether Europe's rise was inevitable or accidental. If the latter, then the suppression of Tartaria's memory may have been the greatest act of historical editing ever performed. The mystery endures. Was Tartaria simply a phantom drawn by cartographers, or a forgotten power erased to make Europe's conquest of the world appear unique, inevitable, and divinely ordained? The deliberate concealment of empires past warns us that history is never only about what happened, it is also about who controls the narrative of what we are allowed to remember. And so we return to the unsettling possibility: had Tartaria reached the Americas first, our world might bear little resemblance to the one we inhabit. To entertain this counterfactual is to challenge the monopoly of official history, and to embrace the haunting truth that what has been hidden may be just as important as what has been told. The question lingers, unanswered but alive: what else lies concealed beneath the dust of centuries, waiting to be unearthed?